the 1930s. Dr. Starr holds a doctorate from Columbia University and a rabbinic ordination from JTS. He is on the faculty of Hebrew College, was the founding director of MEA, a program many of you may be familiar with, and has taught at both Brandeis and the Wexner Heritage Program. We are so honored to have him teaching at this upcoming program at Temple Emanu-El, and thank our new director of Congregational Learning, Rabbi Rachel Putterman, who studied with Dr. Starr at Hebrew College and arranged for this program. Registration is required for Dr. Starr's class, and shortly after this program today, we will be distributing an email to our full adult education mailing list with all of the information and a link for registration. If you are not on that mailing list, you can go to the Temple Emanu-El website homepage, and there will be a graphic there where you can also register in that way. And I think we were going to put
I just put it in the chat, the registration link also.
Yeah, okay, it's in the chat. Okay. Also, we invite you to tell your family and friends about this class. It is truly a unique opportunity. And with that, let's turn to today's program, which Rabbi Rachel Putterman will be moderating. Rabbi?
Thank you, Karen. So I'm very excited to be here with everybody. And I'm the new director of Congregational Learning, Rabbi Rachel Putterman. I started July 1, and it's been a very full few months, but I haven't been to one of these. So I'm very honored to be here with Mimi Lemay. I read the book in the middle of the summer, early on, and then I've just been rereading it now again, and it's so moving, so powerful. I'll shut up now. Okay, so Mimi Lemay is an author, an advocate for transgender rights, and a member of Human Rights Campaign's Parents for Transgender Equality Council. She's written for the Boston Globe and has appeared on national and international TV. Mimi and the entire Lemay family, who live locally, right?
Yes.
Yes. Fought for passage of an equal access public accommodations law in Massachusetts in 2015 to 2016, against the repeal of the law in 2017, 2018. That was the Yes on 3 campaign, right?
That's right.
Yes, was very involved in, and yes. And for a successful conversion therapy ban in 2019. Mimi holds a master's in law and diplomacy from Tufts University and went to BU undergrad, yes?
Yep.
And has written a critically acclaimed memoir, What We Will Become, A Mother, a Son, and a Journey of Transformation, which was released by Houghton Mifflin Harcourt in November 2019. What We Will Become is a finalist for the 2020 Massachusetts Book Awards. And my understanding is that this came out of a blog post that you wrote, but I'm hoping you'll share all this. So before we go any further, I just, Cantervera is recording this so that people who can't make it today will be able to watch it at a later point. So just that disclaimer. And the chat will not be public, but as Mimi is speaking, if you have questions that arise, please put them in the chat. And after Mimi's done with her presentation, I'm going to pick a few questions. So everybody's questions are not going to get asked. We don't have enough time, but I'm going to try and clump them in subject matter so that each question covers a few questions. But please put the questions in the chat, and only the moderators will be able to see them. Oh, sorry. No, you should just chat to me. Put your questions just directed to me. Okay, great. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, we'll figure it all out. And I'm delighted that you're all here today. This is a lovely size crowd. I wish I could be there in person, seeing your faces, but this will have to do until a different time. But thank you, Rabbi Rachel, for the lovely introduction and for moderating. And I am very excited. Thank you, Cantervera, for bringing me on board, and Karen Newborn for providing this program. I'm delighted to be here. Thank you to the entire synagogue. And yeah, so it's interesting. My journey began in a way which I never could have imagined that I would ever be involved in advocacy for transgender rights. I was born in Jerusalem in 1976 to a secular Israeli father who taught at the Hebrew University, and a mother who, even though she was getting her PhD in philosophy, was becoming increasingly more Orthodox as I grew up. And my parents split when I was 5, and she moved us to Brookline, Massachusetts, where we lived in an small Orthodox community in Brookline. And from there, we moved to Muncie, New York. And those of you who are familiar with Muncie, it is a very, very ultra-Orthodox, mainly Hasidic community in Rockland County, New York, where there are little enclaves that different Hasidic sects belong to. And the life there is almost like you could step back into 19th, 18th century Europe in terms of the garb, the long black cloaks for the men, the coats, and then the streimels, the headdresses, the fur headdresses, and the stringent restrictions on what women would wear and how women would behave as well came with the religious laws that I was raised with. We weren't Hasidic, but we were what we would call black hat yeshivish. And I was required to dress from a very early age in, well covered, and to be mindful of the kind of eye contact I made with people of the opposite sex, and the way I spoke, and the way I thought, and the way I conducted myself, and the blessings I would make before every meal, and as well as the very strict laws of Shabbat that we followed, where we weren't able to drive to synagogue or turn on a light switch. And, there is so much beauty and valid, growth for a human soul in a very traditional background. But for me as a young woman, I wanted to study the Torah. I wanted to be a rabbi. But I knew that was never going to be an option for me in this community. It was the understanding of the people who sort of were in power in my community, which would be the males and the rabbis, that a woman's place was in the home, producing, creating a physical haven for the man who would then go out and study and learn and lead in the community. So for me, I felt like I was cut off from the very thing that I was the most excited about in my Judaism. And that's why it's so beautiful for me to see a rabbi who is a woman and a scholar and a cantor. I'm sure you have a lot of scholarship as well in the Torah, because it never occurred to me that that was something I could do with my life as well. And as I got closer to the age of marriage, which in this community is very young, shortly after high school or seminary, young women were expected to get married and begin to grow their families and take care of their husbands' physical, emotional needs so that they could go learn. I was increasingly unhappy with my place in the world that I lived in. And instead of saying to myself, well, I'm going to emancipate myself, there's another version of Judaism. People are practicing it differently across the world, and I could have everything that I wanted. I could have my Torah and eat my cake too. I didn't think that was possible for me. So instead, I blamed myself and I said, there must be something wrong with me. The way God designed me, He must have created a flaw, that I want all these things, that I'm not satisfied being told that I will be an Azer, a helpmate to my husband, and not the person who was able to commune with the divine through learning, which is what I really, really sought. But a stroke of fate at the age of 20 ended an arranged engagement that I had, and I felt suddenly that I was free. I would be able to make a different choice in my life. And it was a sad thing for me to have lost so much faith in my community. And I talk about it in the book, The Arranged Engagement Broken. It was a shocking event. This young man apparently had an affair with someone, which is very unusual in our community, and had admitted it to me a month before the wedding, and it was off. My mom and my stepdad said it was off. And I felt very bereft, but this was an opportunity for me in hindsight to make a break and to leave. And I chose to leave and go to university in Boston all by myself. We were living in England at the time because my mother had followed me to seminary in England and ended up marrying my stepdad and living there in the Gateshead community. And coming to Boston, I had to reinvent myself all over again as a new person, and turned my intellectual curiosity to my secular studies in university, studying international relations, ended up meeting and marrying eventually a lovely young man from a Catholic background, though not religious, and felt like I had no more connection to my Jewish faith in a sense. And I would say that I carried with me a bitterness about having wanted something from God, having wanted something from my faith that I couldn't have. And I felt that I had taken myself out of this world, had in a sense excommunicated myself, and that I no longer had a relationship with God because of this. And I think a lot of ex-Orthodox Jews struggle with some of these same things. How much of my faith do I get to reclaim it in my own way? And that is the work I had not yet done when I had 3 little girls, what I thought of as little girls, in quick succession, including my middle child, who for the purposes of the book, I call M, even though that is a pseudonym that my son and I chose together. And when she, and I use the pronoun she with permission from my son, because that is how I thought of him before his transition, when M said that she was a girl at the age of 2.5, it did not register with me. I knew nothing based on my background about transgender people. I thought it was an odd thing, maybe something that adults did, maybe it had something to do with cross-dressing. It didn't enter my purview that a child could be transgender. A child could even know what their gender identity was. And in some ways, the feminist in me would have rejected this idea at first, because I believe that, well, wasn't it true that most of our ideas of male and female come from our gendered society? Therefore, why would anyone care if they were a man and a woman in a truly liberated world? However, my child chose to teach me differently. And at 2.5, M began to say, I am a boy. Say this consistently, say this clearly, to say, no, I am not pretending, I am a boy. And this insistence was accompanied by a growing sadness and anger that I could see in my child. They had been the happiest, jolliest little toddler. But then as they approached their 3rd birthday, they became angrier and angrier, more insistent that they were a boy, and sad, even though we gave them everything that we gave their sisters, one older and one younger at the time. And it just didn't make sense to me. But one thing I felt during this time was a sense of deja vu. Something like this had happened to me before in my life. I was noticing it's almost like a piece of music that you know from long ago, and you hear it again, and it just comes back to haunt you, and suddenly you're in that place again. And the place that I was in my own mind, in my dreams, was back in the seminary, back in a world where I was told, no, you're a woman. God designed you as a woman, and your purpose as a woman is this. And if you fight against it, then you're fighting against the fundamental laws of nature, and that you can never be happy. And yet here was my little child, my innocent child, telling me, no, these laws of nature that you talk about, this boy and this girl, that's wrong. You're wrong, Mom. I am a boy. And after a struggle of close to a year, as he rounded his 3.5 mark, we realized that we needed to reach out for help. So I spoke to a therapist who had some experience with LGBTQ youth. And so that's youth that are not just transgender, but also gay, because that's very different than being transgender. Transgender is the knowledge that your identity does not match the sex that you were assigned at birth. but being gay or lesbian has more to do with who you are attracted to. So one way to describe it is being transgender is who you go to bed as, and, you know, being gay or lesbian might be who you choose to go to bed with. So that's one descriptor. And she said that there was one wonderful organization, a clinic in Massachusetts that could help me sort this out, why my child was insisting this thing that he was a boy. And I called the GEMS clinic at Boston Children's Hospital. And at the time, they weren't helping parents with kids who were 3.5 years old. They were only seeing kids at the age of 10. Because back then, the knowledge that younger children could be transgender had not caught up with the medical community. And so they were delaying any kind of helping parents transition their kids. Transition for a young child means, you know, a new name, a new pronoun, maybe shorter hair or longer hair, depending on what their preference is. Very simple, easy things that affirm their identity. And the medical community weren't really helping parents transition kids early because they said, well, you have time. Kids don't really know who they are. This transgender identity does not set in until later. But they were mistaken. And as just around the time that we ended up transitioning my son, and I'll get to that, there was a new protocol that came out because of some studies that had been done. And it showed that transgender children, no matter how young they are, have just as deep a sense of who they are and are just as strong in the knowledge of their identity as older children are, and as are kids who are not transgender. So my son felt and knew that he was a boy just as strongly as his younger sister knew that she was a girl. And with that understanding that we didn't really have a lot of support for Jacob to transition, and at the time he was going by a bunch of other male names at home, like Jackson and Max, and we called it the nom du jour, the name of the day, we fell into kind of holding pattern where at home, we referred to him with his chosen names of the day. We let him wear whatever he wanted. His hair was in a cute little pixie cut. But at school, he went to school as M, and that was that. But I knew he wasn't really happy, and you could see that. And you could see that he didn't fit in with the boys, he didn't fit in with the girls, and that this sense of sadness lingered in him. It was almost like a curtain was drawn over his eyes. He didn't relate to other people as well. He wouldn't look people in the face. He rarely gave out hugs, even in our family. And he still continued to throw these massive tantrums whenever he was told, oh, you look pretty today, or something happens that highlights the fact that he was seen as a girl. And finally, close to the end of his second to last year of preschool, he's 4.25 years old. And I write in the book about an event, a moment that felt like a near-death experience for us, where I suddenly realized, why am I keeping this child in this no man's land of you're not this and you're not that? He is not whole. He is playing a role for us in both home and at school, but is not getting to be who he genuinely knows he is. For what am I doing this? And I knew that transgender youth have really high rates of suicide and depression. And I could see that, I mean, he was a little boy at this point, but I could see the darkness coming. And I did not want that for my child, and neither did my husband. So shortly after his 4th birthday, we gave him the choice. We said, we believe in you. We believe you when you say that you are a boy. How is it that you want to live? Who do you want to be? And he said, I want to be a boy named Jacob, a boy always. And that's what he has been since that day. And today, Jacob is 10 years old. And he is thriving. And that cloud, that dark curtain has lifted from him. You can see that he is the person he is meant to be. And that lesson, that having faith in my child and allowing them to be authentic, when someone perhaps didn't give me that opportunity growing up. To me, that was the story that needed to be told. And so when I wrote What We Will Become, I wrote the story of my childhood as well in this ultra-Orthodox community, and my very complicated relationship with my own mother, who believed that the best thing for me was to remain within this community when I knew differently about my own needs. And being able to see that my son needed me to break him out of that bond, break him out of the bind of the gender that he was assigned at birth. That, to me, were two sides of the same story. And so I wrote them together in alternating chapters, and that's the composition of What We Will Become. And since then, and I'm sure Rachel will talk about this as well, our family has begun to advocate for other children, because even though Jacob is supported in our home and is doing really well, it's not the case everywhere. It's not the case everywhere across the country or even in Massachusetts. Not all children are supported in their identities. And some of these really horrific outcomes that you see and the statistics that exist about transgender children and young people continue to exist. And until the day that we can say that every transgender or non-binary person can live freely, supported like anyone else, free in the eyes of the law, equal in the eyes of the law, then we have a lot of work to do. And especially in this week, because it happens to be Transgender Awareness Week, which ends on Friday with Transgender Day of Remembrance. In this country, in the US, over 47 to date, 47 transgender people have met violent ends this year alone. And this number continues to grow. And as long as our society does not stand up and say enough of this, everyone deserves to live freely. As long as you're not hurting somebody else, you deserve to live an authentic life, and we deserve to celebrate and allow you to do that. Then this will continue. So I'm really glad that everyone here is here today, especially this week, the week of Transgender Day of Remembrance, because we have a lot of work to do. Thank you. Rabbi Rachel, did you have any questions?
I have a few questions, but I would also love for people to put some questions in the chat. But I'll start with mine and give people a chance to do theirs. So I have a few different questions. So as a rabbi, I'm curious, because in your book, it was so clear, and in your talk too, that you loved text study, that you loved it. So yeah. I'm curious, are you doing any of that now?
Not enough. My life has been, it's been all advocacy since my son came out. But I have had a growing sense of wanting to reclaim that and wanting to study. So if there's if there's a chavruta out there who wants to study with me, I would absolutely love it. I think this is something I need to bring back into my life, because I still have dreams where I dream about lines from the Talmud. You see, Rabbi Rachel, we weren't allowed to own, the women weren't allowed to own books of the Talmud, but they would print out little lines for us from different psukim from the Talmud, and they would talk about that. The rabbis would talk about that in the classes, and that's all I got, and that enough. There were times when I would cry just reading a certain Mishnah or something. So I do want to bring that back into my life, but it's been all advocacy ever since Jacob transitioned.
I totally get that. The need is huge. Yeah. So you should check out Sfara.
Okay. All right. I have heard of it.
Yeah.
Yes.
Check it out. Okay. That was my selfish question. Okay. So I'm just curious, one question about what you just spoke about. What was, you said the incident at when he was 4 1/4? You said,
yeah.
What was that, the Disneyland trip or what?
No, well, that was the beginning of it. I think in stages, I was slowly beginning to realize that Jacob needed to be allowed to be who he was. I think one of the first moments, aha moments to me, and it was actually a really painful moment, came before he was 4, it was as he was approaching his 4th birthday, he was in preschool, and the preschool teacher had a little parent check-in, sort of like a parent teacher conference. And she pulled out this massive stack of adorable, papers that my son had, and I say my son now because he is my son. He had drawn all these pictures and done all his ABCs and was starting to group together numbers and knew all his colors and animals. And on every paper that the kids produced, all the work they produced, they were expected to write their name. And in school, he was M. And she, I just saw this hesitation on her face as she was saying, oh, he's doing really good. She's doing really good. She's starting to play more with the other kids. She's still a little withdrawn, but I can get her to smile sometimes. And then she got to the end of the pile of papers, and she's hesitating, and she says, I want you to see this. And so she pulls out this picture with these all in black, big, thick black marker. These figures, these stick figures, they all look angry or sad, and there's clouds ahead in the sky. And you can just see that the emotion in the picture is just so full, charged with negative energy. And you can see that he had written his name, and then he had scribbled it out right away. And she said, because she knew that he had come into school asking to be a boy, and we had all rejected that. We said, no, you do that at home. That's your home. That's your playing at home. And she said, you know what, Mrs. Lemay, could it possibly be that she actually believes she's a boy? Like that this is real? It's not like an insistence, a want to be boyish. It's not a tomboy thing. And at that moment, seeing, her at the time cross out her name like that as if to erase her identity, that's the moment that I realized that we were playing with very high stakes, that this was real for my child, which meant that the trauma to my child was also real. And that's when we began to reach out for help and find a therapist, which we were able to find one who was able to talk to us on the phone extensively because they weren't covered by our insurance. And so we began to exchange information. But then came Disney, and I talk about this in the book. We went to Disney World for the first time, and Jacob had chosen a Prince Charming costume that we got off of Amazon. And he wore it, and he had a kind of shortish haircut, and we were in a new place. We had never taken a big family vacation before that was any more than going down to the Cape, but he didn't know anyone in Disney World except for our immediate family, and people just assumed he was a boy. And the way that kid came to life during this time was absolutely remarkable. And it was another penny dropping. It takes a few sometimes before you finally realize, hey, somebody's in here. Before you finally realize, the truth. And finally, what you're referring to, this event, was we almost got into a car accident. It was just a busy day, last day of preschool of the year. And we're driving in our neighborhood. We have a really bad intersection where you can't see, you kind of have to zip across when you have a space because there's no light. And, but the cars are coming fast in both directions. And I thought I could make it, but then I realized that the car behind the car that I had waited for was coming in too fast. And I pulled through the intersection. I probably squeaked by with a few inches to spare. And everything in the car got thrown around as I'm zooming through this intersection. And my kids are all like, what happened, Mom? And I'm like, nothing happened, thank God. But my mind kept going. And as I was driving home, I kept imagining, what if we had an impact? What if one of my kids had gotten badly hurt? What if it had been the child who's been asking me for a year and a half now to live as he knows himself to be? And what really broke me out of my my fearful stupor of, I don't know what to do for this kid. I can't move. I can't make a decision here. What if I do the wrong thing? Is the thought, what if this had been his last day? What would I have wanted to have done for him? And at that point, it was abundantly clear. And I still cry when I think about that, the emotional impact of that moment of realizing that life is too short. And, you know, all of the scary things that you hear can happen to transgender youth if they're not supported. It was beginning with my son's 4th year where he was unhappy. And it was up to me and it was up to my husband to be able to free him from this bind that he was in. And thankfully, I think it was just it felt like a miracle to me. And I don't mind saying that. It felt like a miracle because he came to life and he was happier than I ever imagined he could have been. And all those things that we worried about, that he wasn't relating to other kids, that he wasn't able to give affection, those things just disappeared within a matter of weeks. And in some ways, and I talk about this at length in the book, in some ways, it brought me back my faith as well. My faith in Judaism, my faith in God, my faith in myself, because my narrative had been that, well, God created me a certain way and I wasn't happy and there's something wrong with me. And so I left. And that was my narrative. And it was an angry narrative, but realizing that Jacob could never have survived in the world that I grew up in, it suddenly turned everything on its head. And I realized, nahapochu, it's exactly the opposite. I was meant to leave. My leaving was blessed. And if that is the case, then God had always been with me the whole time. And from that moment forward, I saw it not only as my obligation to my son to be an advocate, but as a holy obligation, as a God-intended obligation for me to use my abilities and my story to bring a community of support around transgender people and transgender youth in particular.
Thank you. I'm going to circle back to a couple more of my questions following up on what you just said. I want to include some of the audience's questions. So one is, how does Jacob feel about your book and about your public advocacy based on his transition that's put you?
That's a great question. It's the $1 million question because ordinarily kids, don't necessarily like to be spoken about publicly. So every step of the way, we have asked Jacob permission to share his story. And what I'm sharing is less of his story and more of my story, but I still need his permission to talk about the experiences I had as a mother with him. And he has given permission very bravely, knowing that other kids are not necessarily as supported as he has been. And it's been a double-edged sword. So for some time, there were times when he, when he was in like 3rd or 4th grade, when he said, for a while, he said, I don't want to do this advocacy anymore. Mom, you can do it, you can talk, but I don't want to show up for anything. And we respected that. And if he had asked me to step back and maybe use a pseudonym or, even exit from advocacy, I would have done that for him because the first and foremost person that I need to protect is my son. But I am blessed that he has continued to give me permission to advocate, and more so that he has actually begun advocating for himself as well. So some of you may have seen the town hall, this HRC CNN town hall that was done in LA, October 2019, where all the then Democratic candidates, with the exception of Bernie Sanders, who was sick at the time, joined to talk about LGBTQ rights, and audience members got to ask questions. Well, my son asked a question of our Senator Elizabeth Warren, and he was so proud of that moment. And it was televised. It was a big deal for him and for us. And he just stood up there and said, what will you do as president to protect transgender kids in school? And from then on, he's been asking more and more to do advocacy with me. and to even start to do some of his own. So he'll do an interview. If I do an interview about the book, he'll offer, to answer questions as well. And sometimes even with book talks like this. So I'm sure if the audience wanted to ask him a question, he'd probably be delighted to come in. Yeah. So he's doing pretty good, and I'm really proud of him.
Such a heartwarming story. So I'm going to combine a couple questions here. So people are asking about how is Jacob's relationship with his sisters?
Mhm.
I know that you talk about Ella during the time of the transition.
Mhm.
And then somebody also asked about your mom and how is she doing with all of this? So
Yeah.
how beyond you and your husband, the other family members responded, and what are the relationships like? Yeah.
At the time of transition, I think it was a lot harder to talk to my mom about it, because my mom is still ultra Orthodox Jewish. And, like I said, unfortunately, in her community, there is no room for LGBTQ identities. And I know that is not the case in all Orthodox communities. I know a lot of work is being done, and it is life-saving work. And organizations like Keshet, which you mentioned before the audience came on, have done some amazing work in this regard, as do synagogues, to be more inclusive. However, in her community, there's no acceptance overall of the LGBTQ community. And so she still belongs to that world in a sense, but she loves her grandson. And I know a lot of people who are listening will appreciate that, because some of us were raised with very strong traditions and beliefs about what it meant to be Jewish. And then you might have a child who falls in love with and marries somebody who isn't Jewish. And then the grandkids come along, and frequently when a child, the living, breathing beauty of a grandchild is what it takes to move a heart and to open up a heart. And my mother was able to see my grandson's true essence, who he was, his joy. And no matter what she feels or believes in the community she's with, she supports him. And so, she described it probably the best way. She said, I have a foot in both worlds. And she does. So she's still in many ways connected to the ultra-Orthodox community, even though she did end up moving back to Massachusetts, visits us very frequently. But, she loves her grandson, and her grandson is trans, and that's it. And so she makes it work somehow, probably, compartmentalization. In terms of the siblings, and I'm going to say siblings, on purpose, because Jacob's younger sister was very young when he transitioned. So for her, it was just the new norm. And in some ways, she is, to me, an example of the younger generation who doesn't seem to care at all, who you are, as long as you are a decent human being. And so I love to see that. She's very close to her brother. And then the older sibling and I say sibling because just over this past summer, Ella has come out to us as non-binary, which is kind of feeling that neither masculine nor feminine really fits for them, and they use them pronouns. So going by the name Eli now. And it was really hard for Eli in the first 2 or 3 months, because they were extremely close to their brother. And I think there was a sense of loss, and we had to work through that together. And they were probably holding out with the name and the pronoun for the longest time of anyone in our family, with the exception of my mother, who granted, she was a little older, so it was harder for her. But, it took a while for Eli to realize that they still had a sibling who loved them, who probably was healthier and happier and loved them even more because of being healthy and happy and whole. And so eventually Eli became Jacob's fiercest advocate. And when we would speak out publicly against something like the removal of the Title IX protections for transgender children under the current and outgoing administration, it was Eli who grabbed the microphone at the Attorney General's press conference and spoke absolutely beautifully in defense of her brother, as their brother. So they've done well, but it's a balancing act as an advocate family, because we need to try to provide all our children with a sense that they are equally important, even if we happen to be fighting for the rights of one. But now, as it turns out, fighting for the rights of two.
Okay, thanks. So a couple of people have asked, and if this is crossing a boundary, please be straight. They're curious about whether Jacob's going to have surgery at some point. So.
Okay, well, I'm very open as an advocate to answering questions. Typically, if you were talking to a friend or a neighbor with a transgender child, you wouldn't ask that question, but this is the perfect format to ask that. So thank you. And I will speak more generally because, there are age limitations on accessing different transgender medical interventions. And they don't begin until puberty. So Jacob right now is 10. So typically at the age of puberty, a child or a young person rather, because again, they're adolescents at that point, an adolescent whose sex assigned at birth does not match their gender identity might choose to delay puberty for a few years. And that gives everybody time to figure out what the best course of action is for that person. And it's just like a pause button on puberty with a puberty blocker. So that's typically the first move with a medical intervention with a young transgender person. And again, that does not occur before puberty. And after that, several years in, if the adolescent chooses, they may have access to hormones. And so, for example, a transgender male teenager might take a little bit of testosterone, and a transgender female would take a little bit of estrogen. Then they would start to see some development in a way that would make them comfortable with their bodies, because gender dysphoria, that sense of discomfort with your body because it doesn't match your gender identity, is one of the most painful experiences that a lot of transgender youth go through, and it puts them at high risk for depression and anxiety. So these are essential medical interventions for a lot of youth. And I have to say, not everybody goes through the same transitional journey. Some people only have asocial transition, and that is what they're comfortable with. Some people have a medical transition. For some people, it's a legal transition. They might just change their name legally or their gender marker on a birth certificate. So there are a lot of different ways to transition, and none of them are more valid than any other. And so it is only after having accessed these earlier stages of medical intervention that the question of surgery comes up. Thankfully, we would not have to have one surgery that some transgender males have, which is a removal of breast tissue. We don't have to do that because with blockers, we wouldn't be in the position of him growing breasts as well. So that was one thing that we wouldn't have to deal with. And in terms of the gender reassignment surgery, which might be the one that the questioner is thinking about, those are choices that come closer to adulthood. Yeah, and that's something that's going to be entirely up to Jacob, and he is well aware of all his choices, and that his parents support him. And it's going to be him and his team of his endocrinologists and his psychologists and everybody who, working together over all these years, is going to come up with the best thing for him. And I'm confident that they will. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, a couple more back to my questions. So I'm curious. I read, Shulam Dean's book.
Yes. Yeah.
He grew up very Orthodox and was an Orthodox adult, and then eventually left. I'm just telling the audience. He wrote a memoir about it called "All Those Who Go Do Not Return."
Yes.
And then I read, Joy Layden's memoir.
Yes.
About transitioning from male to female
at Yeshiva University, right?
Right. Yes. Right. So I read those around the same time, and I remember I read Joy Ladin's first and then Shulam Dean. And I remember thinking there's something so parallel here, which is exactly what your book is about. But I would love for you to articulate what is the similarity. I know it's about being your authentic self, but there's what is and why are the numbers of mental health issues so high? You know, both, right? There's a lot of people who leave Orthodoxy who don't land on their feet or not easily, or you know, it's wrenching. So if you could speak to that.
What really struck me, I read a book by Lynn Davidman about becoming unorthodox, and she looks at a particular subset of the ultra-Orthodox community, the Hasidic community who leaves, and she talked about stages of leaving this very rigorous world. So when you grow up Orthodox, it's your entire framework of being. It's the way you see the world. It's the way you will filter anything you read from the news through the lens of Orthodoxy. You will filter science through the lens of Orthodoxy. You will filter communications with other people, relationships. Everything comes through the filter of Orthodoxy. So when you remove that filter, when someone leaves, that sense of being absolutely formless and having no identity is really strong. And it is quite painful for a lot of people who leave Orthodoxy, as well as the fact that when you leave Orthodoxy, frequently you lose your family, you might lose a job, you might lose a child, as in Shulam Dean's experience. And you were suddenly alone. You were in a tight community where everyone functioned as a tightly knit unit, and suddenly you're adrift. And so it was remarkable to me when I began to learn stories of gender transitions, the kind of similarities of being adrift, of losing your entire framework, because your framework, the way people view you in terms of gender, the place you have in society is, for example, a father, and then you become a mother, and suddenly everything has changed for you. No one sees you the same. And the kind of vulnerability that you have is really, is similar in some ways. And Lynn Davidman talks about, she uses the word passing, that moment that you don the garb, for example, as an ex-ultra-Orthodox Jew, you'll wear a pair of jeans. And I talk about this in the book, the first time I wore a pair of jeans and the way the wind, whistled through, the gap between my two legs, and how odd that was for me, and how freeing and how dangerous it felt, that you pass as one of the world and you're no longer cloaked and masked in the mask of your community. And that is the same language that many people who transition use when they talk about dressing in a way which is more typically effeminate, for example, or more masculine, in order to fit in with the gender that they identify with. This moment of passing, do I pass? And I found that remarkable, that there's these similarities. The world you are with just dissolves. The world that you're part of dissolves when you change your gender in the eyes of other people. And the world that you belong to dissolves when you leave a community that cannot make room for heresy of this nature, of leaving the religious boundaries. I'm very lucky to have a mother who still talks to me and is still part of my life. I'm also very lucky because I have coping skills and abilities and talents that I wouldn't not necessarily have had my mother not been a Baalat Tshuva and had given me an emphasis on secular education as well, because a lot of people who leave the ultra-Orthodox community literally cannot speak the language. Their vernacular might be Yiddish. They may not understand how to move about the world. And in a kind of slightly milder way, I had that kind of shell-shocked experience of stepping into the world, not knowing how men and women related to each other in a secular world. How do I take what people say to me? What do I wear on different occasions? How do I pay for things? I was so sheltered that it was really a unique experience. But like any trial by fire, making it through to the other side can give you just this deeper appreciation for who you are, for what you're willing to fight for, to live authentically. And I think in both cases, that those who pull through and are able to are stronger for it.
I just realized that it was your own experience that probably helped you help Jake, like allow Jacob, enable Jacob to transition and then become an advocate, right? It sounds like.
Well, in some ways, the environment that I was talking about, where, you know, there was not a lot of public support for parents to transition kids young. And again, transition for Jacob at the age of 4.5 just meant, you know, he got to have the haircut he wanted, he got to have the name he wanted and the pronouns and be referred to and seen as he. But there wasn't a lot of support to go to that extent with a kid at that age. People were like, just wait, just watch and wait. You'll see, you know, see what happens. And, you know, information hadn't been there. People hadn't looked enough at the set of young transgender children to be able to say what they were saying months later, which is support your child, even if they're young, because the risks, the emotional risks are not worth delaying a transition. And I think the fact that I was able to see that before the protocol had changed had a lot to do with the fact that I recognized the kind of torment he was in. And that was the torment that I had been in a different way, but being told God designed you a certain way because you're a female. Even your body was designed to be, you know, accepting of male power, for example. Those were some of the things I'd been told. And that sense of like, there's something wrong with me, I can't make myself fit into this role, was something that I saw on my son as well at a very young age. And that kind of distress was something I didn't want him to go through. And I said, you know, excuse my French, screw it. I've done this before. I've left and I survived. We can leave. We can help him leave from the constraints of what society has placed on him, and we will all survive. But his mental health comes first.
Well, we're almost out of time. It really did strike me how clear he was that because I think with Joy Layden's memoir, it's this process. I'm sure Joy Layden was clear too, but this, when you get older, this is process, or the process of leaving orthodoxy. But your son was so clear. Like he didn't need a process, it seems like.
Yeah, he knew who he was. We all needed to understand, you know, because I think the beauty is that he found the words to tell us. He didn't know the word transgender, obviously, but he found the words to say, I a boy, you know, at a very young age. And the beauty of it is that he was so gosh darn stubborn, and he would not give up. And a lot of kids do give up. And that's when they start to internalize some of the shame and suffering that you see that comes out when they're older. But I am always grateful for him that he persisted and that he was very vocal about it. And, you know, he's bullheaded still sometimes, but God love it. Because you know what, he saved his own life. And, you know, I'm just so grateful that he was open with us.
Well, he was lucky to have you as parents. One very quick question before we're done. So you've done all this advocacy in the last few years. I'm curious, what's the next, you know, issue that you're working on? Is it in Massachusetts, nation? Like, what's going on?
Well, I've been really lucky to be able to work with the Biden campaign as a consultant, you know, not in an official capacity with the campaign, but on their LGBTQ plus policy team. And so I'm really excited to say that they have a lot of work that they intend to do, including protections for transgender children in schools, and to reverse the military ban on transgender troops, and some other stuff coming up. And what we need to continue doing is educating. You know, the experience of transgender people in different states, for example, can be vastly different. In more conservative communities, transgender people do not have the same access and respect and validation that they should have. And so there's a lot of work to be done. And so I will continue speaking, I'll continue writing. I don't have plans right now for a second book, but if I did, it would be about the advocacy years. And I will get to that as soon as the dust settles on everything here in my life. But, you know, I feel really, really blessed to have this opportunity to talk about this.
Thank you so much. Wait, somebody just said, yeah. So please express bravo to your message to all parents and help us as parents to accept our children for who they are. So thank you so much. That was so great. I'm so honored to have met you and that we all got to hear from you.
Thank you. The pleasure and the honor is mine.
And if you want to be chavruta, if you have a moment, let me know.
You know what? It's a date, and I don't know when it'll happen, but it's a date. You know, I would love that, and I've been longing for that. Thank you.
Cantor Vera, would you like to say something in closing?
Just more gratitude. Thank you for sharing your journey. Thank you for sharing your son's journey. Thank you for the generosity and the teaching that you modeled for all of us today, and that I know you and your family will continue to do, and for bringing us into this work.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And thank you for listening and having me here. It's been an honor.
And I want to thank everybody who showed up and asked great questions, and Paula and Karen for all the hard work putting this all together. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks, Mimi.
Thank you.